Okay, greetings to all. Thank you everybody for taking the time to join us in this guest speaker series that we have introduced in the Global MBA program under the auspices of University of London Worldwide. I'm very pleased that Dr. Sarah Gordon has accepted my invitation to give us a lecture about a topic that she is professionally expert. She is the Chief Executive Officer and the founder. She may be kind enough to discuss this in a while of an organization, a consulting company called Satarla, that focuses in risk management and related consulting activities. And as far as I'm aware, she covers a substantial number of countries all over the world with a very extensive network of associate and consultants and trainers on issues related to enterprise risk management. So the 30 minutes or so, let's say, presentation will be about these issues. I'm pretty sure that we will learn a lot about this topic, and I will kindly ask you, in the case that we haven't done it already, to mute your microphones. You are all, I assume, aware that you can use your chat box. Please refrain of sending messages throughout the presentation, but if you want, you can prepare them by typing them, but do not press the enter so they will not appear, let's say, throughout the presentation. Sometimes they are confusing and we lose track when we deal with questions and issues. So, having said this, please again mute your microphones. I welcome you in this session, and I hope that Sarah can start presenting the topic, but first of all herself and the organization to us. Thank you, Sarah. Please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Dimitrios, and thank you for inviting myself to come and present to all of you here today. It's a great honor, and I actually got my PhD from Imperial College before they left the University of London, so I'm also an alumni. So there we go. So thank you very much for bringing me back here today. So yes, the topic that I'm going to talk about is ESG, or environment, social and governance risk management, how to integrate sustainability into your business decisions. But just before I go into that, so I am indeed the CEO and the co-founder of Satarla. We are a risk management consultancy with experts based all over the world. We've got entities registered in the UK, South Africa, Australia and Canada, but 80 associates who cover almost every other jurisdiction you can think of. And we specialize in making risk management real and practical. So that is not ticking the box risk management. This is proper business and decision-based risk management that brings together all of those different types of risk that we might face no matter what our organization, including financial, legal, technical, and of course, ESG. And it's on the basis of that that I'm going to share some thoughts with you here today, as well as some examples of where we've seen this work. And also some suggestions as to what we see might be coming down the pipeline at us as business leaders over the next few decades. So over the course of the next 30 minutes, I'm going to share these thoughts with you, but I would also very much welcome you to ask any questions you like when we finish. I'll also make my email address freely available, so if people want to catch up with me or any of the Satarla team afterwards, please do feel free to do so. We've also loaded the presentation that I'm going to go through today onto our website. So that little URL that you can see there, so www.satarla.com/post/ESG risk management. If you go to that blog post, you will be able to find the majority of the slides and the materials that I'm going to go through during this session. So please do feel free to follow along. So what are we going to talk about? I'm going to start off with just a recap on what do we mean by enterprise-wide risk management, because there are many different ways of interpreting this. And this is a case where we do lots and lots of work with the Institute of Risk Management. So I should also say that I am representing the Institute of Risk Management here today during today's session. And so a big thank you to them for releasing me from their clutches of training, because we do lots of training on their behalf, to be able to come and give this presentation to you. So we're going to start off with, what does enterprise risk management look like? What does it do? And then we're going to go into, what do we actually mean by environment, social and governance? So what does ESG actually look like? Why is it important? So why do we think that ESG is important now, and what does it look like going into the future? And then finally, we're going to end on ESG risk management. So that is the framework or the content for the talk that I'm going to give now. So diving straight in, when we talk about enterprise risk management, we're actually talking about making decisions. Enterprise risk management is a decision-making tool, and we make decisions by balancing risks. We look at the pros, we look at the cons, either side of a potential decision, and we say, okay, do I turn left, do I turn right? What does this balanced approach actually give me? And the great thing about enterprise risk management is it looks at risks in the form of a network. Traditional risk management is very siloed. It's all about categorizing your risks so that you can aggregate them and escalate them through the organization. Whereas modern risk management really looks at things as a network, and it also accepts that there can be a huge amount of uncertainty around some risks, whereas other risks might be almost certain. Okay, so we're seeing a massive variety in terms of what those risks look like. And what we're looking at here is that risks can be positive or negative. And by managing them, we're trying to take charge of some of the uncertainty that is involved within those risks. So we're looking at the uncertainties, be they positive, be they negative, that matter to us, and what can we do about them to try and guide them in a direction that is going to help us as an organization. So how do we do risk management? Well, there are a myriad of different processes out there. And whilst I'm a geologist by background, so trust me, I can make 30 minutes of your lives really dull because I can talk about rocks, or I can make it dull because I can talk about risk management and risk management standards for 30 minutes. Don't worry, I'm not about to do that. But what you can do is you can boil all these standards down, and it doesn't matter which risk management process you are looking at. They can be boiled down to 4 simple steps. Step number 1, understand the context in which you're trying to operate and how it is changing. And with that, what are the objectives you're trying to achieve, and the values, for example, that you are trying to achieve those objectives within. Step number 2, assess those risks. And by assessing the risks, we mean 3 things. We mean identify those risks, understand them, and say, so what? Do we want to do anything about them? In standard speak, that would be identify, analyze, and evaluate those risks. It all means the same thing. Then we have step number 3, which is managing those risks. And that is taking charge of the uncertainty surrounding those risks. And when we're managing those risks, we can either do something about the likelihood of those risks occurring, or the total impact that those risks might have on our organization. And remember that some of those risks might be positive, so we might be actively trying to make those risks happen, whereas other risks might be negative, and so we'd be actively trying to stop those risks from happening, or at least reduce the total impacts should those risks occur. And then finally, we have monitor, review, and reporting. And that allows us to check, does any of this actually work? Are we actually making a difference with regards to those risks? And also allows us to follow that final arrow back to the beginning of our process again, because that allows us to ask the question, based on the context in which we're attempting to operate and the objectives we're trying to achieve and the risks that we face and our ability to manage them, can we actually achieve those objectives? If the answer is yes, then that's great. You've got everything in balance and you can carry on. If the answer is no, then you have 2 options. Firstly, you can either pump more time, money, or effort into managing those risks. If you can't do that, or you can't do it anymore, then your other option is to change your objectives. So move your goalposts. And what this allows us to often do is to say, okay, we may well have an objective that is to do with, say, production or making money, but we can't achieve that in a safe manner. So what does this therefore mean? How do we balance this out? Can we put more controls in place to manage those risks with regards to safety? Or do we maybe need to rein in a bit on those production objectives to enable us to be able to achieve them in a safe manner? So ERM is about, or enterprise risk management, is about aligning risk-based decisions across the organization, and it's about bringing together different disciplines. So often when we're talking about risk management, you have specialists who are very, very good at financial risk management or technical risk management or health and safety risk management, etc. But the bit that people really struggle with is that environment, social, and governance risk management. And the problem is that your risk profile for your organization is not complete if you don't include ESG within it. For those of you who've read the abstract that accompanies this talk, you'll see that I often get asked, oh, do you do ESG risk management, seeing as you are an enterprise risk management specialist? And I have to almost stop myself from laughing, because if you're not including ESG within that overarching risk management, then you're not doing a very good job of your overarching risk management. You need to be able to include that in the overarching profile. So enterprise risk management is purely risk management across the entirety of the organization. And by that, we mean the whole depth of the organization, so very much from the front line all the way through to the boardroom, and then across all of the different functions, all of the different business units that you might have as well. Enterprise risk management is not synonymous with strategic risk management. Enterprise risk management is everything bundled together. So it includes your operational risk management, your strategic risk management. It pulls everything together, because by doing that, we get a much more accurate picture of what is going on within our organization and what risks we might face. And the reason why we get that more accurate picture is because we portray risks as a network. So something that might be a risk to one person may not be a risk to another, but it might be causing one of their risks. Similarly, if you see a risk or a control change somewhere else in the organization, what might be that domino effect or that causal effect as it flows through the organization towards you? Now we can begin to stitch everything together, and then we can begin to model, okay, what if I don't take ESG seriously? What if I don't apply that level of budget to this part of the organization? What is that going to look like? So this sounds potentially very complicated, but trust me in that you can make this incredibly simple, because that core risk management process, those 4 simple steps, that is just a decision-making process. It's the same process that we use when we cross the road through to if we're making multiple billion-dollar acquisition decisions. So it's the same process that we use. We're just going to do some of them in more detail and use more detailed tools to help us with them than others, but it's the same decision-making process that we use, no matter if we're applying it to financial risks or to ESG risks. So on that note, what do we really mean by ESG, sustainability, CSR, license to operate, etc.? What does all of this actually mean? Well, if we go back in time to the 1980s, and I'm acutely aware that some of you may not have been born in the 1980s, but back in 1987, there was convened the World Commission on Environment and Development. And part of this commission, they produced this paper called Our Common Future. And if you're interested in sustainability, this is a must read, okay? Because this is where an awful lot of the background to what then happened came from. So this is where this term sustainable development really came into being. And they defined sustainable development as being development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And you can see that flow through the decades up until 2020 in slightly different formats. So back in the 1980s, when we were talking about sustainable development and what do we mean, we really talked about three different aspects. So social, economic, and environment. Okay, so very, very similar to the ESG that we talk about today, but it was framed ever so slightly differently. And this is what sustainable development looked like in the 1980s, the 1990s, etc. And with that, we then began to develop really quite robust frameworks and tools to say, how do we get the world to move forwards with regards to some of this? In the year 2000, we had the Millennium Goals, and they took us through until 2015, when they were superseded by the Sustainable Development Goals, or the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And as you can see here, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, there are 17 of them. They have a huge number of targets that sit underneath them, a huge number of indicators. And these stats that you see here, this was as of 2015. And I know that these have grown since then. We still only have our 17 goals, but these things are big. I mean, these are big ambitions, things like no poverty. Okay, that is a massive goal that we want to be able to achieve by 2030. Things like good health. Well, that's been interesting this year, but I'm pretty sure we've all learnt or are learning a huge amount from COVID-19. So these sustainable development goals, they've really begun to take root inside lots of businesses, championed by many different governments, and of course supported by many different NGOs and different charities as well. But sustainability, sustainable development goals, etc., this is now really encapsulated through this term ESG. Okay, so what do we mean by this thing called ESG? And ESG quite simply just stands for environment, social, and governance. Now, some organizations take this and they take quite a narrow view to what is meant by the environment, the social, and the governance. But actually what it's trying to do is it's saying you cannot deal with environmental factors in isolation. You need to be able to look at them alongside the context of the social and the governance, and vice versa. Also, what we're talking about here is we're not just talking about nitty-gritty environmental aspects, we're talking about the broader sustainability of what we're doing. And so therefore, most organizations tend to go for the big picture view rather than very specific narrow views. But just diving into those narrow views, and what do we actually mean by environment, social, and governance? So environment, okay, this can mean all kinds of things. So land use, how are we using our land? Does it have industrial facilities built on it, or is it virgin rainforests? What sort of biodiversity and nature conservation is going on within those lands? How about with regards to our activities that we might be undertaking within that environment? Are we emitting things like noise and vibration and different emissions into the atmosphere round about us? What about water? How much water is there? Is there too much? Is there too little? And what about the quality of that water? How about climate change? What about everything that we're doing as human beings? Is that impacting on climate and how it's changing? And if so, how much? What's going on with regards to all of that? And then if we're undertaking, say, raw materials type activities such as mining or oil and gas, etc., what about the rehabilitation or the closure of those sites once we finish extracting the material from the ground? How does that really look? So environmental, we're not just talking about carbon, it is much broader than that, and we're beginning to see that supported by many of the regulations and many of the financial focus points that are coming through at the moment. So carbon, it doesn't end there when we're looking at environmental, and in fact if you're only focusing on carbon, you may actually be having a detrimental effect on other parts of the environment. So we need to be able to look at it in the round. So everything that you see on the screen in front of you here are potential areas of risk for your organization with regards to the environment. How about social? So when we're thinking about social, we're thinking about communities, we're thinking about people. And with regards to that, yes, of course, we're thinking about the health and safety of those individuals, including their mental well-being, etc., which of course is immensely important right now, given that everybody has been in very unusual circumstances during COVID-19. But we're also thinking about stakeholder engagement. So how do we try and understand the perspectives of other individuals who might be working round about us? And they might be contractors, for example, to our businesses, or they might just be people who live next door. Okay, what are those perspectives and what are those expectations from those people, and also expectations for shared value? If you're bringing something new to a region, what do they get out of it? What do you get out of it? What does that look like? What about local procurement? What about local hiring? What about site access? What about those social impacts? How does a business impact on the social context, but also how does the social context impact on a business? So again, when we're looking at risks, we're looking at risks posed by an organization on the environment and the social context in which it sits, but also we're looking at how does the environment and social context impact on your business as well. So those risks flow out and they flow in. Finally, what about governance? And when we're talking about governance, we kind of tend to split this into two parts. We're talking about our corporate governance, so what's going on within our organization, how diverse, for example, is our board of directors? What about our business ethics? What's our purpose? What are our values? Do we pay our taxes? So how transparent are we with regards to that? And what kind of tools and techniques and strategies do we use for our stakeholder engagement? But we also look at the broader governance. So what about the government of the countries in which we're working? What about the regulatory bodies to which we need to be compliant with, for example, depending on what sort of business activities we are undertaking? So what does this look like from both that corporate governance perspective and then that broader governance perspective? All of that comes into the governance of the ESG. Now, this is nothing new, okay? There are so many standards, guidelines, frameworks, principles, etc. that's out there. They have been around for a long, long time. And for example, anybody here who's done work in, say, Africa, with regards to the World Bank, for example, you'll be well acquainted with the Equator Principles. And of course, these are principles that are applied to financing of projects in different parts of the world. And they've always looked at, okay, how do we make sure that we've incorporated sustainability into our decision making and our performance with regards to the investing of that money? But it's not just the Equator Principles. As you can see on this screen in front of you, there's a whole myriad of other frameworks and standards out there, and they are all being updated the entire time. This was a snapshot of some of those different standards and frameworks from about this time last year. So this is now really quite old, and this is just pertaining to one sector. This is pertaining to the extractive sector. And this was just an array of some of the different standards and frameworks, etc., that a mining company, for example, may want to think about complying with or taking guidance from in the pursuit of their activities, especially with regards to environment, social, and governance. So there's a huge array of standards, guidance out there that can help us understand what is meant by ESG. And whilst it is there to help us, sometimes it almost gets in the way because we can't see the wood for the trees. There's too much stuff that is out there in terms of trying to understand what is important and how do we as business leaders make sure that our organizations are truly acting in an environmentally, a socially and a governance adequate way. Okay. Also as well, when we're thinking about ESG, we're not just thinking about the threats associated with not meeting those requirements. Okay, so compliance-based risk management as well is pretty old school now. We're looking at the opportunities, we're looking at the upsides, we're looking at what benefit can we bring both to our businesses but also society by taking advantage of different aspects in environment, social and governance. So we're looking at the upside, not just the downside that comes with not managing these things. And many of these frameworks and standards are now being adapted to enable people to get credit for putting in place the foundations for those opportunities as well as managing those potential threats. So why should we actually care about this? Why is this important? Well, I'm sure you've seen in many different newspapers, etc. So this is just one from the FT, the fallacy of ESG investing and the fact that you can never have win-win situations on the ground. And yes, to a certain extent, that is true, but that's only really true when we're talking about short-term profits. And actually, many organizations are now not focusing solely on the financials or on the profits. Instead, they're focusing more on the big picture, they're focusing more on their purpose within society, and they're also saying, okay, what are our values? What is our culture as an organization? Be you working with a bank, through to a charity, it doesn't matter. This concept of what is the organizational culture is so important. And this is a case here where risk management can be one of those mechanisms through which you can really entrench and embed and build your culture, or the culture that you're trying to build within that organization. Because all the way through you can say, okay, can I actually achieve those objectives in line with my purpose or in line with the values that I have set for my organization? And if one bit of my organization doesn't do that, how does that then contaminate the rest of my organization through that network of risks? And we also see this through the style of governance as well. If we have that culture of transparency and openness, then risk management can really act as one of those very objective tools through which you can raise different risks through the organization. And by doing that, you become a much more resilient company. Resilient, of course, being one of those key words for 2020. And the key to resilience is by including all of those different aspects of ESG. We want to include all of those different aspects together. This little diagram here is one of my favorites, and actually I can make a video available to you where you can see us drawing it properly. But it's a take on the likes of the Johari window, and also this concept of known knowns, known unknowns, unknown unknowns, etc., where our known knowns are those facts. So those are the things that have generally happened. We then have known unknowns or acknowledged risks. So those are the risks that we are talking about and we're potentially managing within our organizations. We then have our true surprises or black swans. So depending on how you are defining a black swan within enterprise risk management means a true surprise. So you just did not see it coming. And I'd like to stake my claim on this in that COVID-19 was not a black swan. We all knew that a global pandemic could hit us, we just were not ready for it. And so therefore COVID-19 is an example of an elephant or an unacknowledged risk. So we knew it was there, we just were doing nothing to proactively manage it. And one of the big values with regards to ESG is to really look at those elephants through this lens of risk management and say, okay, what kind of ESG risks might we have to our organization? Are we actually acknowledging them? Are we dealing with those elephants in the room? And what we often find, especially with those ESG risks, is that they are complicated, they are difficult to understand, and almost impossible to measure, primarily because there's so much uncertainty involved with them. And so what we want to do is we want to take those really uncertain ESG risks, those elephants, and move them down into that acknowledged risks territory, and then we can do something about them. And the key with that is that one day you might think you have no elephants, the next day you've got lots, and that's because the world is changing very, very quickly. The world is changing very fast round about us, and of course we've seen that very much this year. But just to take a step back with regards to our changing world, so I'm sure we've all seen all of the different projections in terms of how many people we think might be on our planet by 2050. And of course, all those people on our planets, they are developing or moving forwards in some way. And this particular image here, or this graphic, looks at internet use across the world, but this is from 2017. I suspect it looks very, very different in 2020. And with regards to all of this, people want different materials, okay? We don't want the coal, the iron ore, the aluminium and the copper. That's not where it ends in terms of the materials we need. We now need things like rare earth elements, lithium, cobalt, materials that until pretty recently, nobody saw the commercial value in digging those materials out the ground. But of course, it's not just mobile phones, it's also cars, it's wind turbines. So being able to get hold of these materials is absolutely core to ensuring we have a sustainable energy transition and we don't actually cause more damage to our planet by moving away from oil and gas and coal. And instead, we're setting ourselves up for a sustainable future. Yes, of course, we can recycle lots of the material that we have, but we just don't have enough in that circular economy yet. So we need to be extracting those raw materials out of the ground still now to feed that circular economy, coupled with the fact that we need to get better with regards to our technological prowess to manage that circular economy as well and make sure we can recycle these materials. So as a global population, we are becoming increasingly aware and concerned of the provenance of where all of this material comes from. And the reason why I'm saying this, of course, is that a lot of this value chain, one of the big problems with it is its impact on environment, social and governance. And the reason why we're becoming more aware of this is not just because the millennials are here. Okay, I think I personally get frustrated when people blame things on the millennials. The oldest millennials are 40. We're now the majority of the workforce. So actually, all of those morals and the ethics that come through with that millennial generation, actually, it's here, it's now, and also it's here to stay going into the future. So when we talk about ESG as a whole, this is something which is now being very much integrated into all of our decision making. It's not just how we run businesses, it's not just the decisions we make with regards to risk, but it's also the investors. The investors have arrived. The investors have been around for a long time with regards to sustainability, but now we're beginning to make it real. Instead of just talking about ESG, we're now doing ESG, and the ways of measuring this is changing, and that's in part because, of course, everybody is beginning to align on this. So all of those different stakeholders are beginning to align around the purpose and the value that comes with ESG. Also, we're getting the policymakers are aligning on this. So within Europe, we're now talking about our Green Deal. We don't just talk about carbon anymore. We're going much further beyond just that carbon discussion. We're also saying, how do we measure all of this stuff? And let's focus in on impact and action focused measurement, not do you have a policy? Having policies doesn't cut it anymore. You need to be able to prove that you are doing the right thing with regards to all of this. And of course, we can use different technology to measure how are we managing these risks, or what risks are we allowing to go uncontrolled. We could use satellites to measure the emissions that are being generated from heavy industry. 2 years ago, that wasn't possible. It's now becoming commonplace. So technology is moving forward very, very quickly. And of course, we've got massive updates going on with regards to things like the governance of raw materials. So this is real. This isn't just a big vision. This stuff here is real, and it's here to stay, and it's core within that ESG risk management and therefore decision making within our businesses. But it's not easy, because even those ESG risks conflict with one another. Those 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals do not align with one another. There is conflict between them. If we wanted to take everybody out of poverty, we could do that pretty easily, but it wouldn't last for very long because we would have destroyed the environment, for example. So how do we do all of this in balanced, in a risk-based format? ESG risks are, of course, often very complicated, and we need to understand which component parts we want to look at, and we need to be comfortable with the fact that many of them are very uncertain, and so therefore many of those risks may well be emerging. Okay, so an emerging risk is just a normal risk with a lot of uncertainty involved with it. Okay, so what do those risks truly look like? And ultimately, of course, we need to be able to balance all of those risks together and say, okay, I can accept quite a lot of financial risk, but actually on balance, that means that I help a lot of my environmental risks, for example. So how do we balance that risk profile or portfolio across our organization as a whole? The key to successful enterprise-wide risk management, or the key to making those balanced decisions, is to include all of them together, including those ESG risks. There's very little point in just doing ESG risk management. You have to be able to integrate it into the entirety of the risk management across your full organization. So in summary, just before I open up for questions, 5 key points. So firstly, we make decisions by balancing risk. So risk management isn't that boring Excel tables that you just tick a box and turn things red, yellow, green, or whatever takes your fancy. Okay, so that is very much old school risk management. The purpose of risk management is to make these balanced decisions. Ideally, we should be viewing these risks in the form of a network, because then we can stick them all together and we can say, where do the ESG aspects fit into the rest of the organization? And actually, does it change things like the entire strategy of our organization? ESG by some can be considered as a marker of culture and also adherence to values. So if we are truly managing our ESG risks within our companies, then actually that says a lot about our culture within our organizations and what we truly do when we get below the surface of those organizations. Conflicts between those risks is normal. You're never going to have everything aligned and pointing in the right direction. You need to make choices between those risks on a daily basis. And finally, ignore ESG at your peril, because it is here to stay and actually provides us with massive opportunity going into the future on a business sense, but also on a societal sense as well. So with that, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and I open up for questions. Thank you very much, Dimitrios.
Thank you, Sarah. Very lively and to the point presentation. A lot of issues that we can reflect. I mean, from my let's say point of view, that my background is on strategic management primarily. In the last 10 to 12 years or more, I'm working a lot of corporate governance, so I can relate to many things that you are discussing. But if I go back to the fundamental issues of risk, in the past, I have concerns about this concept, risk, because always I was getting confused with the risk as a noun and the risk as a verb. So I was thinking, because I was teaching the course about external environment, about dynamic, complex, unfavorable environments, where, at least from a consulting point of view or from an entrepreneurial point of view, you identify threats. The very well-known model, strength, weakness, opportunity, threats. And threats are external environmental conditions, external environmental facts. You use the word facts in one of your slides, that for the company that we are discussing, a particular, let's say, observer, is a negative development. And this is a threat. Maybe objectively, I mean, beyond any human being, maybe nothing is negative or positive in the big picture, let's say, of the world. So I assume risks are like threats that can be both internal and external, although the vast majority of our discussion is on external issue, not risks that they are within the boundaries of the organization. Let's say a tragic accident that kills a football team. It's a risk, I assume, for every football team or any club, any athletic club, but it is internal, let's say. As external threats like environmental catastrophes, fires or pandemics, that to some extent can be foreseen or whatever. Do you have any further insights to frame if the risk is a completely new concept, or if it is something that we knew, but now it takes maybe more crystallized, let's say, position, or something like this?
Yeah, sure. So the traditional way of looking at risk was just looking at those potential threats. And most organizations just looked at the internal threats within the organization, because the external stuff was a bit too difficult, or there was too much uncertainty to deal with. So that is quite old-fashioned risk management. It works very well in some areas. So things like health and safety risk management, because you are talking about stopping people from being hurt, and generally you're talking about things within your business. So that form of risk assessment works well for health and safety. but it misses out on a huge array of risks when we go beyond health and safety. And this is something here where, because so much risk management comes from the health and safety world, because they've done amazing work in trying to make it a tool that works for them, actually, if we get too stuck in that, we miss out on what true risk management can really be. So when you go to, say, ISO 31000, which is one of the go-to standards for enterprise risk management, they define risk as being the effect of uncertainty on our objectives, and we can be thinking about potential threats or potential opportunities. And so you'll find risk managers using things like a SWOT, and when they get to the opportunities and the threats bit, now we're into the risks territory, and we just say potential opportunities or potential threats. And that's how we begin to bundle it together. And we also need to be thinking, yes, about those risks that are internal to the organization, but also the risks that are external to the organization as well. And that's where the network really comes into being, because as we know, something can change miles away. And through that network, it suddenly becomes a really big either opportunity or threat for our organization. And so I think what has happened with risk management over the last 10, 15 years is it's grown very much so. And where you see organizations using it very impactfully, it's where the chief risk officer sits right beside the CEO, and they are almost the voice of conscience in the CEO's ear. And they're saying, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Is that in line with our purpose? Are you sure? And what that helps us do, and I see there's some really, really good questions coming in, what that means is if an organization is very intent on profits for now, that means, okay, fine, you can go after those profits, but you are probably setting yourselves up with a liability for the future. And that's what we see in many companies, is if you're not taking that longer term horizon view, you're setting yourself up for big problems in the far distant future. And no longer can you hide, because in many jurisdictions of the world, people will bring class actions or what have you against you, even decades down the line, for stuff that you've done in the past.
On this note, I think you are addressing to a great extent George's questions, which comes first at 11:13:20. I see is asking to what extent this activity should be centralized or not, but you have addressed Anita's question about to what extent there is conflict between, let's say, profits, because you cover it somehow, and ESG priorities, let's say, if the company is tuned up for profits. By the way, from my academic experience, the word profit is so complicated. If we mean, let's say, gross profit, profit after tax, before tax, long-term profit, short-term profits, profit per share or whatever, it's not that clear. So sometimes it's very naive to talk about profits, but most probably we mean financial, short-term financial results. I don't know if you want to say something more about the centralization. By the way, let me know if you know more than I do. Is it going to be a legislation for the boards to have risk committees like let's say any other committee soon, with designated risk officers at the board level? Is it something that is coming, let's say? Is it something that you can see coming as a legislation or requirement?
Yeah, so I think that, I mean, in many organizations and in many jurisdictions, the audit committee is called the Risk and Audit Committee. So you often include risk in there, and I'm sure you know much more about this than I do. And from experience, they work better when you put risk first, and so you can take a look at the risk profile of the organization, and then you dive into the audits, for example, that may have been undertaken during that particular time period. So I've worked in the past as director of risk and assurance, so I've sat there in the boardrooms, etc., and certainly done that role and ascertained how do we get that governance to really help the organization rather than just being the tick box, which sometimes it can turn into. In some sectors, we're also seeing the requirement for a competent person or somebody who is accountable for certain areas of risk. So, for example, within mining, where there have been some significant disasters over the last few years with regards to the failure of tailings dams or waste dams, that not only has caused significant environment and social problems, but also have killed huge numbers of people within the organisations and caused mining to have a good look at its own governance with regards to how it's run. And that has led to the requirement for somebody at a very senior position to be accountable for the management of tailings dams within the sector. Okay, so every company needs to have someone who is effectively that risk owner and is that go-to person. I anticipate as well, with regards to everything that's in the press at the moment, with regards to Rio Tinto and the destruction of cultural heritage caves in Australia, that actually we may see an embellishment on that. And so it might be a case where we require either someone who looks after cultural heritage at that level, or what would be really nice is for them to say, actually, you know what, this is just part of the risk management process, and let's get that right, because the mechanism sits there already. The danger with having someone who is responsible for a single area of risk at that high level is it becomes siloed. And so people just look at tailings dams, whereas if anybody on the call, I'm sure that we do have some people who work in the raw materials sectors, as soon as you start calling out just one risk, sometimes that can be to the detriment of the management of some of the other risks. It might actually be more important to that organisation. So hopefully that answers that part of your question. Just coming back to George again, though, because he mentioned appetite. And that's a case there where this concept of appetite and tolerance is really nice when it comes to ESG, because what you can say is actually how much risk do we want to take in this area? So do we actively want to go and say mine in a national park, okay, which you would think would pose lots of threats to the business, but actually it gives massive opportunity to prove that you can mine in an environmentally friendly manner, for example. But then also, what is the tolerance that you'll have with certain risks? So again, and my apologies for constantly going back to mining, until now, mining companies had massive tolerance for destruction of cultural heritage sites, and we see that through their actions. But actually what's happening now is that social opinion is very much going against those mining companies and saying, no, you cannot tolerate that anymore. That is no longer appropriate. And so we're going to see that tolerance zone narrowing to say, actually, you need to make sure you don't destruct or destroy those cultural heritage sites. And to be able to achieve that, we need a tightening in governance, we need a tightening on the financial side, and then of course the actions of those companies as well. So George, thank you very much for that question, because the appetite and tolerance is important. Just to finish that off though, it comes back to the strategy of the organization and saying, right, if this is what we're trying to do, how much wiggle room either side of those objectives or that strategy are we willing to accept? So how much risk are we willing to accept in the pursuit of those objectives? And that's where it comes into that appetite and tolerance. And we have to be able to include ESG within that. It's not just a financial figure. Sorry, Dimitrios.
Very nice. I have seen another question. Felicita is asking, which of the three factors, maybe through your experience, you have found difficulty to let's say, manage or to offer advice? Is ESG, is ESG, whatever? I mean, what is there any easy answer, or they are going hand by hand?
So it's a really good question, and actually the one that people have most difficulty with is the social side, because it's all to do with people, and people are very difficult to measure. So this is something where the environment, there are lots of metrics that we can use there. Governance, similarly, there are lots of ways of measuring that and holding ourselves to account with regards to governance. But social is really tough, because it's very nebulous in terms of trying to understand what it means. And when you get into the social space, you have to accept that many of those risks will be wicked, in that they're going to be very complex, and there's probably not going to be a solution. Rather, you just have to tackle those risks rather than aim to solve them. So you aim to make them a little bit better rather than come up with that silver bullet solution. So it's a good question, and typically it's the S that people find the most difficult. Also because you may have some people who really like something that you're doing, and then one person who hates it, and they're the ones that cause all the problems. So the social side is probably the most difficult one.
Because the time is running and I want to have at least 1 minute to thank you a couple of times. Another question is about digitalization and how this will affect the ESG risk management. Is there any relationship? I assume it's a matter of transparency actually, but is there anything that comes to your mind on this?
So I think it depends on what is truly meant by digitalization. But if it's a case where, yes, we have more data in terms of what's going on in an organization, it is therefore, it sheds more light on what is truly happening within an organization. And so therefore you should be able to see much faster where you are truly addressing your ESG risks or not. Of course, the danger is that you get buried in metrics and you start measuring the wrong thing. And to a certain extent, that's what has happened with the measurement of carbon, because as I mentioned earlier on, ESG is much bigger than just the carbon question. You've got to be looking at things like other forms of gases such as SOx and NOx, but also biodiversity, etc. as well, in order to be able to get a balanced overview of, are you truly managing those ESG risks? So it's a good question. Thank you for that.
Okay, another one is something that I mean, it's very personal how your journey, which is nice, because MBA, this is what I say to MBA students, irrespectively of their first degree. I mean, MBA is a pivot for any other job, but at the end, you may want to say something about how, from a geologist, you move into enterprise risk management. But I assume there are strong industrial roots there. So you want to say something before we go to a question that I don't really understand? It seems that there is a 7th-generation principle. Do you read? I mean, I cannot even pronounce this Haidonushon. I don't know. I mean, I don't know the word. If it is something that exists in the industry, I'm not aware of. So my apologies. Can you see they can dash it? Do you know anything about this? Because I'm irrelevant with this.
Yeah. So Candace, I'm assuming you're in North America, and I think you're talking about the Haudenosaunee. Apologies, my pronunciation is probably incorrect here. I'm not aware actually of the 7 generations approach, but I'd love to hear more about it. And I think that's something there where, with regards to native title owners or indigenous people of different parts of the world, how do they view different aspects of these risks? Because of course, often we can be fairly arrogant from a business perspective in that we don't take the time to understand the cultural significance of an area, but also how time is viewed as well. And so just very different perspectives in terms of how different sites, for example, are viewed, and trying to actually get underneath the skin of that and understand it can be really tough, because we are taught to think in a fairly one-dimensional view. So I'd be very interested to hear more about that. Just quickly on the passage from a geologist through to a risk management professional. So as a geologist, you never really know what's going on underneath the ground. It's all guesswork. And anyone who's worked as an economic geologist, you spend your life talking about uncertainty, because it's through that you then say, okay, I think we've got X number of tons at whatever concentration in the ground. So from that aspect, it was actually a fairly straightforward move into risk management. But also I too actually started off as a geographer, and so personally I really love it where you can bring together the technical world with the human world and say, okay, how do they come together? And then of course with the business decisions or government decisions world as well. So it's a very nice way to get to at this point in time in my career, and I'm interested to see what's going to happen next.
Either Joel or your geography is Greek, so it's fine with me, Sarah. I mean, we can work together in many different kind of professions. Now, I want to thank everybody for coming in. I want to thank you for this wonderful presentation, and and the time that you devoted to us. I'm sure that some of our attendees, they may contact you. It was very kind of you providing the link, and everybody can, I assume, can double click and find your organization and what you are doing. So definitely they can come in touch with you. They can connect with you. Maybe there are some opportunities. But from the University of London Worldwide, I thank you very much warmly. It was an amazing presentation and very insightful comments. We will be, of course, in touch. I thank everybody for the time and all the best. Avoid any risks in terms of pandemic, which is a risk. As you said, it was not unexpected, but we didn't want to deal with this. So many films have foreseen this event. Now we have seen them in retrospect, but it is common sense. The world becomes one big small village, so everything can be spread, both good things and bad things. So Sarah, thank you very, very much. All the best, and we will be in touch, and thank you everybody. Yeah,
Brilliant. Thank you.
thank you guys. Bye bye, Sarah. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.